Hey, welcome back everybody. This is Ian, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to make a ChatGPT-like chatbot from scratch. So we're going to use this guide over on medium.com, this article that was written by the team over at PromptLayer, and it's going to show us how to do this step by step. So let's go ahead and get into it. So at the top here, Jared, the author of the article, talks about the history of ChatGPT, talks about how in the earliest versions, it was just a simple system prompt. And we have an example of that here. You are ChatGPT, a large language model trained by OpenAI based on the GPT 3.5 architecture. This is your knowledge cutoff date, 2022-01, and then the current date was 2023-11-01. So it says here that technically the first version of ChatGPT actually used GPT-3, which was completion based, not chat. And the system prompt is a paradigm that began with GPT 3.5, not longer after ChatGPT's initial release. So you can learn more about that in this little link right here. But we're going to go ahead and move on to the point here where he talks about how even though it started out really simple, very quickly after getting some user input and also seeing how there were some malicious requests and injections and getting feedback ideas and feature requests, that the prompts, the little simple one that we saw above, actually ballooned into this giant prompt that you see here. So feel free to go through and read this on your own time. There is a lot of stuff in here, but essentially they're trying to create a bunch of safeguards that are saying like, hey, if you get this type of input, make sure that you don't do this or you do that, and just trying to cover all their bases. So there's a lot of stuff that got added there. This is what Jared's referring to as prompt debt, and even companies like OpenAI are not immune to this sort of thing. So with a little bit of history behind us, let's go ahead and dive into building my ChatGPT, which is going to be our little chatbot here. All right, so we have some steps here. We're actually going to break this tutorial up into two parts. And in today's part, we're going to go over writing our system prompt, building the chat interface, and connecting to logs for debugging. And then in the future video, we're going to provide my ChatGPT with world information, things like today's date and the location of the user. And then we're going to add calculator tools to offset where the LLM falls short. So we'll be able to connect to a function that can then do some operations for us. Lastly, we're going to talk about different ways to make development easier. So production deploys, snippets, and regression tests. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and get started. One thing that we want to point out here is that much has already been written about ChatGPT. This particular tutorial will focus on some of the best practices of building a chatbot like this My ChatGPT that we're going to build. Jared adds here that he believes the best way to approach prompt engineering is to treat the LLM as a black box. It's simply just writing English and checking the output. We will build our development environment around this principle, primarily optimizing for speed of development, where quick prompt iterations and feedback cycles are a necessity. The first thing we want to do is write our system prompt. So let's start there. Basically, we need to tell our chatbot about itself. We need to give it some context so it understands what it's supposed to do. Okay, so that's going to be achieved with a prompt layer in this case, but we're going to set a system prompt. So that's the starting point for this. You can see the example here. There's a link to prompt layer. If you don't have a free account, you can go there and sign up, and you can create your first prompt template. So this shows you step by step what you need to do. You're going to create a new prompt template. It's going to default to chat. You're going to paste in the system prompt, and then you're going to set an initial user message with an input variable called question. So we're going to scroll down here. We actually get to copy this prompt for the system prompt, which is pretty nice. So we'll go ahead and copy that. And if you want, you can link to prompt layer right here. This is what prompt layer looks like when you have it opened up and you're signed in. And you can follow instructions here, or you can just follow along with me, but essentially we want to create a new prompt template. So the way we can do that is head over to our registry, and you can see I've already created one here, so I'll go ahead and let's see if we can just rename this to number 2, and then we'll create a brand new one. Where's my button? We'll move that. Here's this blue button here, create template. So we'll click on that. And then we have our system prompt. So you'll notice that it's defaulted to chat. Completion is the older version, the way that it used to be done. Now in newer versions of GPT 3.5 Turbo and GPT-4, GPT-4 Omni, we use chat. All right, so on the left-hand side here for the system, we're going to paste in what we copied from the tutorial, essentially telling the bot that you are an AI assistant called My ChatGPT. You are a large language model. Please be as helpful as possible. If you don't know the answer, don't be afraid to say, I don't know. And then we need to create a new message here. And we're going to use single curly brackets here because you'll notice we have F string selected here. If you did Jinja, I think you would do double curly brackets. But with F string selected for our template, we're going to add in a variable called question. And you'll notice right away under input variables, it actually identifies that variable named question. And now it's going to expect us to pass in a variable called question with some dynamic value. So down here under parameters, we'll click on set parameters. And here you can decide which model provider you want, which model you want from that provider, and you can tweak the various settings. So I'm going to leave all the defaults, OpenAI, GPT 3.5 Turbo, temperature 1, maximum tokens 256, and so on. So with that set, we'll go ahead and click on Create Template here. And here's where you can set your initial prompt version message, like a commit message. If you're coming from a programming background, you're probably familiar with commits from something like Git for version control. This is optional. You don't have to do it. It'll create a message for you if you don't. But since it's the initial version, I just use the init commit syntax and say next. So it's going to ask if you want to run an evaluation. We don't need to do that just yet. So we're going to go ahead and save this by clicking on confirm. And it's reminding me to set a title. Thank you. So up here at the top, there's the title. And this part is very important because we're going to use this title to actually fetch this template whenever we're writing out our code here in a moment. So we're going to call it my with a capital M, chat with a capital C, and then all caps GPT, my chat GPT. All right, cool. So now if we try to create the template, it should go through. Commit message. Again, I'm just going to say init commit and click on next and then click on confirm. And here we go. I've got my template. So we're going to return to this in a bit. We'll actually be viewing the history of all of our requests on the left here, clicking on the requests as they come through and viewing information about those. But for now, let's head back over to the tutorial. All right, here we are back at the tutorial. We've already copied this system role message right here and we've put it into our prompt template. The next step is going to be building the chat interface. So it talks about creating a new GitHub repo. You're welcome to do that if you want to track your project on GitHub. I'm going to go ahead and skip that. But essentially, you'll want to create a new project. And if you do it on GitHub, you'll want to clone it down. Otherwise, you'll just want to create a new project inside of your code editor. Once you have your project ready, we're going to go ahead and use Poetry for the virtual environment. If you want to use Poetry, great. If you don't have it installed, go ahead and look it up. Otherwise, feel free to use whatever you want for your virtual environment. These commands here, if you have Poetry installed, are going to go ahead and initialize the project, and then they're going to add our dependencies. So let's head over to our code editor. You'll notice that I have an app.py file already created and open, but it's empty. So if I ls inside of my ChatGPT demo folder, you'll see that I have that one file. All right, so let's run these commands real quick. Poetry init, Poetry add prompt layer, Poetry add OpenAI, and Poetry add python.env. So running that, it's actually going to start by asking you some questions about your Poetry project. You can just run through all of these until you get to the end. And then it's going to update, install, resolve all the dependencies. Great. So once that's done, you get back to your prompt. You can check and see that you have a Poetry lock file and a PyProject toml file. Great. So let's head over to the tutorial and go ahead with the next step. So now that we have all of our dependencies installed and our virtual environment set up, we want to go ahead and create a .env file. And this is where we're going to set our OpenAI API key and our prompt layer API key. So if you're not familiar with where to get those with prompt layer, you just go to your settings for your account and it'll have a button for getting your API key. Click on that, generate a new key and copy it, and you can bring it over to your env file and paste it there. Likewise, for OpenAI, you go log into your account and then go to your settings and you can get your API key from there as well. So once you have both of those inside of your .env file and you've set them equal to these two variable names, OpenAI API key and prompt layer API key, then you're ready to go with the next step. So inside of your app.py file, we're going to set up some boilerplate code for bringing in .env, OS, OpenAI, and prompt layer. So go ahead and copy this code right here and paste this in. So again, we're going to import OS and we're going to get .env. That's going to allow us to pull in our environment variable for prompt layer. The one for OpenAI gets pulled in for us automatically, so we don't have to worry about that. We import OpenAI and we import prompt layer. We load the env file and then we go ahead and set up our prompt layer client by setting it equal to prompt layer, and then you can pass in your prompt layer API key. So then we're going to set up our OpenAI client. First thing we do is we actually pull OpenAI from prompt layer client. And once we have that, we go ahead and initialize our client by setting it equal to OpenAI open close parentheses. So that'll invoke the class there and create this new instance, which is our OpenAI client. And we're ready to go. So let's head back over to the tutorial. The first thing it wants us to do is get some user input. So we're going to copy this here, head back over here. And basically we're saying user underscore input is equal to the input method. This is built into Python. And then inside the input method, we just pass it the prompt that we want to display right before we actually get the input from the user. So in this case, welcome to my ChatGPT. How can I help? And then a new line with a little caret that indicates that the user can now type something. So we'll go ahead and save that, head back to the tutorial. So now that we have collected the user input, the next thing we want to do is actually get our prompt template. So we can do that programmatically using the library inside of our code. So of course we'll use prompt layer to do that. You can see the syntax here is just prompt layer client.templates.get, and then you pass in the name of the template. That's why I said it was important that we name it specifically capital M, my, capital C, chat, capital GPT. The next thing you do is you pass in a dictionary with some values for the provider, including your input variables that get injected into that template. The benefit of using prompt layer for the prompt template is that in addition to being able to track all of your responses in a dashboard automatically, we can also tweak our template in one place and have it update anywhere where that template is being used. So we don't have to go out and modify our code anywhere. We literally just go to our dashboard, change the template as we see fit, and then we can continue running our code without any changes there. Pretty cool. So let's go ahead and borrow this code right here. Head over to our code and paste this in, and then let's talk about what it's doing. So here we have the myChatGPT underscore prompt variable set equal to prompt layer client dot templates dot get. And again, this is why it's important that we name this myChatGPT with the exact spelling and the exact capitalization, is because we're actually using that name of the prompt template to pull it into our code. So then after that, we pass in a dictionary here with the provider, in this case OpenAI, and then any input variables. So we have the one user input that we got above. We're going to inject that as the question variable. So if you recall from our prompt template that we created in prompt layer earlier, we did have for the initial user role content, we had a question variable that this is where we actually inject a value into. All right, so after that, we want to actually send the request out to the API. So we use the OpenAI client variable, we use chat completions create, and here we're taking all the values from this myChatGPT prompt LLM quargs, and we're going to dump them into this .create method call. And so it's going to go through and it's going to take each key value pair and it's going to put it in here for us. So that's what this double asterisk is doing here. It's taking those keyword arguments and it's injecting them into .create. And then lastly, we're going to include PL underscore tags, and we're going to put a little tag in here. You will note that this is a list in Python, and so we can include any number of tags that we want. So we will see when we go back to the dashboard for prompt layer in a little bit that we'll have this tag right here. And this one is specifically for development, but if you were doing things in production, you could add a tag or change the tag out for production. That way you could keep track of which requests and which response are what. Cool, so we assign the response of that to the response variable, and then we're going to traverse down into that dictionary that comes back. It has a choices list. We take the first element from that list. It has a message dictionary, which has a content key, and that's going to have a string that points to the actual response. So we're going to print that out, and we should now be able to run our code. We can check with the tutorial just to make sure that, yep, they are actually testing it. So in order for us to test it, we're going to use Poetry. So because Poetry is our virtual environment, we just run Poetry shell. It's going to put us into the virtual environment, and then we can run python app.py. Let's go ahead and try that now. Make sure that your file is saved, and then we'll open up our terminal down here. So we'll just run Poetry shell here. It'll get us into our virtual environment, and then we can run python app.py. Okay, so it says, welcome to my ChatGPT. How can I help? And then we have our little caret here with the space, and then we have our cursor indicating that we can start typing. So we'll just ask it something really simple. We'll say, what is CSS? So cascading style sheets. Wait a second for the response, and there it is. CSS stands for cascading style sheets, blah, 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 blah. Awesome. So we are able to interact with the bot simply by asking it a question, and then it gives us a response. That's cool, but what would be really awesome is if we could ask it questions back to back and actually have a conversation such that it actually has some memory of not just our questions in the past, but also its responses. That's how most chatbots operate, and that's how we want to set this one up. So there's a couple different ways to achieve this. We'll see what the tutorial shows us. Let's go see what the next step is. Ooh, making a loop. Okay, cool. So we were able to ask one question. We were able to get back one answer. But what would be really cool is if we could have a loop that would allow us to continue having a conversation with this chatbot until we decide that we're done. So the way that we're going to achieve this is with a while loop. Every time the LLM responds with a message, we'll ask the user for a response, and we'll append both new messages, so their response and our question, into our prompt. So there's a couple drawbacks of this, of course. Our prompts could get really long really quickly, but this is just an MVP. So in the future, alternatively, if you want to, you could summarize the conversation. You can inject it back into the system prompt context. There's a couple other strategies for this. We're not going to go into them in this tutorial. For now, what we're going to do is we're just going to append their response and our next question back into the messages list. So let's see how to do that. All right, so we have some code here, and it says just add this loop that we've created with this while loop here right after we're done printing the first LLM response from above. So the code that we already have in there, we're just going to add this right after it. So we'll copy this here. We'll head back to our code. So we've printed the response. This is our initial request, initial response, and now we're actually going to paste in this loop here. So I'll make this a little bit smaller so you can kind of see the whole thing here. But basically it starts with prepare the new prompt. A messages variable is equal to my ChatGPT prompt. Now, if you remember, my ChatGPT prompt is the variable we created whenever we pulled the template and we injected the very first user input value. So it had that thing LLM quargs that we were able to dump into this create method for the client chat completions call, and we're going to access messages. If you think back to our template that we created with prompt layer, you'll recall that we had the system role and then we had our user role. The user just had the question variable and the system had its initial prompt. So that's what's going to be inside of the messages list, at least for the first time that we make our initial request. It's going to have that first object with the system role and its content, and then the next object is going to be the user role with the message for its content. So now that we have that messages list, the next thing we want to do is get the response message from the request that we just made. So we have that response variable from the request, and we're going to use choices bracket 0 dot message to get access to the first message. This is going to be the assistant roles message that came back from our initial request. Okay, so we're going to take the assistant's response to our initial question and we're going to append it to the end of the existing messages list, the one we just talked about that had the system role and the initial user. So at this point it goes system, user, assistant, and then what follows is just going to be a back and forth between user and assistant. All right, so inside the loop is how we're going to facilitate that. At this point, we need to get more user input. Okay, so we're going to say user underscore input, the same variable that we used before, is equal to, again, we're going to use the input method. And then here we're just going to have the little bracket or the little caret with the space indicating that the user can now type something. Now that we have the user input, we're going to append that after the assistant role that we just put into our messages list. So here you can see messages.append, and then we have this dictionary. The role is now user. The content is the user input that we just gathered from the user. All right, now we want to send all this to the LLM. So the first thing we do is we're going to access that my ChatGPT prompt. This is our prompt template. We're going to go down into the LLM quargs, and we're going to go over into our messages list here on this object, and we're going to override it with the messages that we have been appending the assistant and user objects to. So essentially we're just updating the my ChatGPT prompt LLM quargs, and the reason we're doing that is because we're actually going to pass that into our next request to OpenAI API. So you can see on the next line, we're getting the response from sending a new request via client chat completions, a creation of a chat completion. So sending out this request to the OpenAI API. And again, we're just dumping the contents of my ChatGPT prompt, LLM Quargs, and this is going to fill in things like which model we're using, what the temperature is, what the messages list is, which at this point is updated, and anything else that's included there. So after that, we have our PL underscore tags. Again, if you wanted to do this in staging or production or whatever the case, you can put any kind of tags you want in here, one or more. It's up to you. You can even leave it empty if you want. For us specifically, we're saying my ChatGPT-dev for our tag. And now we're getting back the response message from that request. So again, we get the response, we assigned it on 44, and we're just going down into the choices list and pulling that message dictionary and assigning that to response message. That way we can go back to our messages list, which is keeping track of all of the different messages. So again, we start with our system, we go to user, then we go to assistant, and then user and assistant. At this point, this response is going to be an assistant because it's a response from the API. And we're going to append that dictionary stored in response message to the messages list. Now we're actually going to print that, and then we're going to start the loop over again. So at this point, what we're printing is the content of the message dictionary from the assistant role, which is going to have the response to the user's last question. And now the user has an opportunity to continue the conversation because we start at the top of the loop again. Awesome. All right, let's go ahead and test this out in our terminal. So with our virtual environment activated, let's go ahead and run python app.py. And it says, welcome to my ChatGPT, how can I help? So here we're going to say, what is, and let's ask, what is HTML? All right, cool. So when it comes back with its answer, you'll notice that we have this little caret here. It's waiting for our next question. So we can continue on. Now, we can keep asking it questions. That's really cool. But what's even cooler is that it has this short-term memory and it recalls information about our past questions and its past responses. So let's try this. Let's say, my name is Ian. What is your name? And it says, hello, Ian. My name is my ChatGPT. How can I assist you today? All right, cool. So we've told it something about ourselves. Now let's say, what was my name again? And it recalls that our name is Ian. It says, your name is Ian. How can I assist you today, Ian? Awesome. So it's actually able to recall information from the history of our conversation. And now I can ask it something else. What is CSS? And it gives me my answer. So when we're done here, we don't have a mechanism for exiting just yet. So you can just do Control D to exit in that way, and it'll take you back to your terminal. All right, cool. Let's jump back out here to the tutorial. And we've already run it. We've tested it out, so you can see these examples here. The last thing we want to do before we go here is add some logging. So everything we've done is really neat, but as is mentioned here, any sufficiently complicated AI application can expect to go through a lot of prompt iterations. So being able to track which ones work and which ones don't work is going to be critical. So we can do that with Prompt Layer. And actually the original inspiration behind Prompt Layer was because the author of this article, Jared, lost one of his good prompts after making a few edits. So you may have experienced this similar frustration where you're working with a prompt and it's working really well for you, but then you edit it a couple times trying to get it to be better, and now maybe it's performing worse, but you can't remember exactly what that original prompt was, and maybe you don't have a history of it anymore. So with Prompt Layer, we're getting the tracking for every single request that we send, which is great. That's built in. If we head over here, we can actually see all these requests that we've sent have actually been tracked here. So you can see what is HTML, and I said, my name is Ian. There's its response. If you go to the next one, it updates with the next part of the conversation. And then the last one, you can see the full conversation. So system role, user, assistant, user, assistant, user, assistant, user, and then the final assistant. All that worked great. And in fact, we can see our tag here, my ChatGPT-dev. We can even add some tags here if there weren't tags that we added whenever we first created the request. But one thing that's not happening is it's not actually connected to the prompt template. So you see no template here in the top left corner. And we want to connect it with the template that we're using, in this case, my ChatGPT. So that's going to be what we're going to do now. Let's head over here, and if we scroll down, you can see there's a link to a way to track which logs were generated with which prompt versions. So you can go ahead and click on the enrichment described here link. And if we do this, it actually takes us over to the prompt layer documentation. It has examples for Python, JavaScript, and REST. In this case, we're going to use the one for Python. So we're going to go ahead and copy this, head back over to our code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put it right after our request. So we send our request, we assign the response to the response variable, and now right here, we're going to paste in this prompt layer client track prompt. And it's looking for a variable called PL underscore request ID. That's actually going to come from the request here because the client, if you recall, even though it's OpenAI, it's being pulled from prompt layer, and so it has some additional features. So what we can do here is we can say response, comma, PL underscore request ID. And then this part, I can't remember exactly. It's like PL request ID is equal to true, but I'm not 100% sure. So we're going to jump over here and see if we can find that. So under request IDs, under logging, if you scroll down here, there it is. It's actually return underscore PL underscore ID. So we're going to go back to our code and we're going to say return underscore PL underscore ID. So what that does, if we add return underscore PL underscore ID equal true inside of this chat completions create method, and then we set a comma PL underscore request underscore ID up here in the assignment for the variables, is that this will actually return a tuple with two values, the first being the response and the second being the ID of the prompt layer request. And the good thing about that is now we can pull the response and we can get whatever information we need about that, but we also have access to our prompt layer request ID so that we can pass it into this code and be able to track the usage of our prompt template. So the next thing after setting the request underscore ID equal to the PL request ID is the prompt name. So you'll want to update this value to be the name of your prompt template. In our case, it's my ChatGPT, capital M, capital C, capital GPT. And then here you've got your prompt input variables. So this could be a dictionary with your input variables. So for example, we know we have one input variable, question, and then we know we set that equal to the user input. Now, if you're using this anywhere else, then you could just create a dictionary and you could add it there. But for simplicity's sake here, we're just going to say this is a literal dictionary with the key of question. We know we only have one variable that we're using. And then at this point, the user input is whatever the user has inputted right here. Cool. So then the last value here is this version equals 2. The 2 is just an example, but you would set this to whichever version of your prompt template you want to use for this tracking. Now, if you don't have a specific version, or if you want to use the latest version rather, what you can do is you can just omit this and it'll always default to whatever the latest version is of that template. So I don't think we have any versions yet. You would get versions if you went over to your registry and you went inside of here. You see we have version 1. And if you made an edit, so you can see there's an edit button here, and you go change some things and then you update and then you do a commit message. And what it would do is it would create a second version here that you could then pass in the number 2 for version 2. If you had multiple versions, you could do it that way. There's also labels that can be used. So if you want to do that, you can refer to the documentation, but it's pretty versatile. Again, if you omit the version, so if we take this out, it's just going to use the latest version of the prompt with the name, in this case, my ChatGPT. So we'll go ahead and remove it, save that, and run our code again and see if it works. Cool. So it's saying, hey, welcome to my ChatGPT. How can I help? And I'll say, who was the first president of the United States? And it says first president was George Washington, with some information about when he served. And then I'll do, my name is Ian. What's yours? It says, hi Ian, I'm my ChatGPT. We can say, what was my name again? And it can say, your name is Ian. How can I help you today, Ian? Awesome. So let's head over to prompt layer here. You can see our most recent tracking here. But notice the difference here. When we click on the latest one, sure, it has the system role and it's got the user and assistant, user, and then the final assistant. So this may look the same as it was before down here, but you'll notice where it says no template, we actually have a template now. You can see if I click on this, it goes straight over to my registry for my ChatGPT, the template that we used. And if we look down here, we can actually see there's some tracking here. And if you mouse over the question variable, you can actually see what the dynamic value was for the variable at the time of this specific request, and a preview of the response from the assistant for that specific request. And then if we go back over here, you can see if you mouse over the text in the most recent user message, the content of it is blue, and if you mouse over it, it actually does a little tooltip telling you the name of the variable assigned to that one, in this case, question. So pretty cool. Now we have some more fine-grained tracking of our prompt template, and anytime we want to go over to it, we can click on that. We can make edits to it. We can have different versions. We can track which version we're using for which prompt requests that we have over inside of our code. Just a lot of versatility added on to what you would normally be doing if you were writing a chatbot. So really cool that Prompt Layer gives us all those features, makes it a lot easier for us to build these types of applications and then iterate on them quickly. That's it for this video. If you go back to the tutorial, you can see that the next thing that we're going to do in the next video here is we're going to provide our chatbot with some real world information. For example, the current date and then the location of the user. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you all in the next video. Peace.